This evening's speaker is an Ig Nobel Prize winner. He's given us a talk before. He's down from St Andrews. A warm welcome to Dr. Charles Paxton.
Well, thanks very much for having me, and this is my first ever experience of being a entertainer on the Fringe, so it's going to be a rather academic talk, so bear with me. My name is Charles Paxton. I'm a psychologist at the University of St Andrews. I do not get paid for any of the work that I'm going to be talking about this evening. Do not worry, taxpayers, your valuable pound has not been wasted on this money. I just have to preface all of my talks on this topic like that.
Are you looking for your CD? Ash, I think there's somebody here for a CD. Oh, sorry. The talk starts.
So this is, I'm going to be talking about the Kraken and the giant squid, and telling you hopefully some things you didn't know about the Kraken and the giant squid. And this is a picture of a younger version of me. This is me as an undergraduate, holding the arm of a giant squid. This is preserved informally in the arm of a giant squid, and this was, frankly, a orgasmic moment for me as an undergraduate. Holding the actual arm of a giant squid was one of the most exciting zoological experiences of my life. Sad but true, ladies and gentlemen. So, I'm going to be talking about the Kraken. Now, you all know about the Kraken. It's a monstrous entity that attacks boats. Legends date back centuries, of course. It's based on a mythologized giant squid. And all of the three statements I just made are, in fact, completely and utterly wrong. There's a very interesting tale about the Kraken. It's a very convoluted tale about the Kraken. It has some interesting insights, my fellow skeptics, into the flaws of skeptical thinking. So, let us move on. Everyone likes the Kraken. Here is the Kraken from the 1981 film Clash of the Titans, stop motion animation by my hero Ray Harryhausen, and of course, in this case, the Kraken was actually replacing the thing they called the Kraken was actually a Ketos in the original Greek legend, which tried to perhaps abduct, sacrifice, eat, I don't know, the lovely Andromeda, but she was rescued by Perseus, who happened to be coming by, and he rescued the girl and went off and had a happy life. Very, very good. The Krakens have also appeared more recently in Pirates of the Caribbean. Here we have the Kraken, controlled by a supernatural entity called Davy Jones, who can, it has the power of attacking boats. There's a sort of squid-like animal there. And then more recently, we've had the remake of Clash of the Titans. Well, they still don't call it a Ketos, they're still calling it the Kraken, and but it's a more flamboyant Kraken than before, and the special effects are no longer stop-motion animation. Now, at this point, I should apologise. I'm going to say Kraken throughout. That isn't because it's correct. It's just I like the word Kraken. How should it be pronounced? There was a debate about this in one of the Pirates of the Caribbean films. Are there any Norwegians or Scandinavians in the audience? Partially. Okay, well, how do you think it should be pronounced?
Kraken.
Kraken. Yeah, and I think that's probably the correct pronunciation. But in English, obviously people say Kraken. They also say Kraken. I suspect there would be Kraken in Norwegian. I also believe that in Norwegian, the en ending on a word, it makes it a definitive article. So it's the Kraka. Kraka. Yeah, the Kraka. So Kraken is the Kraka. Okay. Here's another example of Hollywood taking interest in the Kraken. I have no idea about this film, but it looks pretty damn good to me. And here's another. This is a rum. I thought I'd try and get some of this for when I give this talk in the future. This sort of rum hasn't come to the UK yet. I did say that I was prepared to give talks on the Kraken, and I would take sponsorship if the company did it, but as yet, no such luck. But it's got a lovely, I really like this packaging. As you can see, that's actually derived from an actual image of the Kraken, which we'll see. A sort of image of the Kraken, which we'll see in a moment or two. So here we have the quintessential image of the Kraken. It's a cephalopodon. That is the group of animals that includes the octopuses and the squids. Sort of giant animal, huge, massive, capable of destroying ships, and it lives at the bottom of the sea. So, that's the story then. Kraken followed by giant squid. So we're going to start the story in the middle. We'll begin at the middle. And we have to start the story with a gentleman called Francesco Negri in around about 1698. And he's an Italian travelling to Scandinavia. He reports the account of a thing he calls a sea kraken, a sea kraken, which he says is reported as a sea monster by the people of Scandinavia. And he doesn't really go into too much detail about it, but about 9 years later, another traveller to the north, Franz Paulinus, talks about a similar animal, which he says has the characteristic of being a giant crab. And it's so large that, in fact, a regiment of troops could actually do their manoeuvres on the top of this crab. So the first two accounts, then, it's a very large animal. It doesn't have squiddy characteristics. The next account that I've managed to find is by a clergyman. A clergyman took a great deal of interest in the Kraken. I don't know why, but it's true, as you'll see. You'll not know Kraken. And this is Hans Egede, the Apostle of Greenland. This is a gentleman who made the first return by Scandinavians to Greenland after the loss of the Viking colony in the 18th century. And he wrote a book about the natural history of Greenland. And in that book, he talks about the Kraken. And he says some interesting things about the Kraken. He says it's more like land than fish. He doesn't really go into much of description, but he says that, so it looks like land. He also says it has two names. The name in Sweden is Kraken. The name in Iceland is Hafgudr. Now remember that, because that's going to be important for the story a bit later on. So we've got three accounts of the Kraken, the earliest accounts of the Kraken, and none of them actually mention the squid at all. Well, this idea of a big sea animal that was kind of huge was quite popular, and Linnaeus actually, in one of his books, the Fauna Suenica, actually talks about and names, what's he call it? Microcosmus marinus, which was a huge island-like animal, which he actually named in that edition, but then he subsequently didn't talk about it again. I think he was a bit embarrassed. So that's the famous Linnaeus. And then the most famous clergyman of all to take an interest in the Kraken, famous because he took an interest in the Kraken, is the wonderfully named Eric von Pontoppidan. This chap.
The Latin for a bridge of the town. Optus town, Pont bridge. It sounds like Latin. Pont bridge, Optus town.
Okay, so Eric, bridge of the town. And he describes the Kraken in some detail. Its back or upper part, which appears to be in appearance about an English mile and a half in circumference, some say more, but I choose the least for greater certainty, this is a bit of a skeptic, looks at first like a number of small islands surrounded by something that floats and fluctuates like seaweeds. Here and there, larger rising amongst the other objects, is observed something like sandbanks, on which various kinds of small fishes are seen. At last, several bright points or horns appear, which grow thicker and thicker and higher as they rise above the surface of the water. And sometimes they stand up as high and as large as the mast of a middle-sized vessel. Very, very interesting. The animal has another strange characteristic. It has when it avoids its excrement, to use a discreet phrase, such as the wonderful smell of this excrement of the fishes of the sea, they congregate around the Kraken to feed on its excrement, and then it feeds upon its fishes. So it's kind of like a self-contained ecosystem. Very, very interesting, and that's the feature of the Kraken. Now, Pontoppidan, he was in the 18th century, so he speculated about what the nature of this beast could be. And he wasn't really sure, but he and some other people thought it might be, at least the baby form might be this. Anybody know what this is? It's Gorgonocephalus is its name, which is the Gorgon's head, of course. But it's actually a brittle star, so it's a sort of echinoderm, like the starfishes. And he thought this might be the baby form of the Kraken. So he accepts it's a big thing. It's like the land. It's got perhaps a few arms and stuff, but it could be like an echinoderm. It could be. He did suggest it could be of the polypus kind, which polypus in those times could mean something like a squid, something like an octopus, or something like a jellyfish. So he was quite open about the zoological affinities of the Kraken. So our first few accounts of the Kraken, and you see it could have some elements of being a giant squid, but it's got other elements as well. Above all, it's big, and it often appears like land. Okay, so those are the first accounts of the Kraken, and then the story goes on, and really a variety of people suggested that the Kraken could be associated with a giant cephalopod. But the person responsible for this idea more than anybody else was a dodgy Frenchman by the name of Pierre Denis de Montfort. And he wrote a natural history of mollusks at the tail end of the 18th century, and in that he suggested that there were two giant octopuses in the oceans of the world, and the northern one of those, the Kraken octopus as he called it, was the thing that was responsible for the Kraken. And it's really from Pierre Denis de Montfort that this idea of the Kraken as a cephalopod, that is one of the squids of the octopuses, really comes from. But some people disagreed. And I just find the relevant quotes. I'll have to rely on memory, so it's going to be a bit faulty. Giuseppe Serbai was another Italian who was in Scandinavia at the tail end of the 18th century. He reckoned that stories of Krakens were about as much relevance as stories of hobgoblins and ghosts. It was completely fatuous. Arthur de Capel-Broke was another 19th century explorer of Scandinavia, and he could only find one person who even knew of a Kraken. Captain Douglas of HMS Emerald, he went there in around about 1790 and did a special effort to try and track down Kraken stories, and he found very, very few people who knew of a Kraken. He himself thought it was fabulous. Indeed, not only did he think it was fabulous, one person we've already mentioned, Hans Egede, also thought it was fabulous. He described the stories of it, but he actually reckoned that it was fabulous. Unlike another monster, which we'll talk about in a moment or two. So even from its earliest beginnings, there were people who didn't say, well, this is some sort of mythologized giant squid, but this actually is just a pure fiction. Okay, so I've given you people's views about this. What about the eyewitness testimony? Are there people who actually claim to have seen the Kraken? Well, there are very, very few. There are a number of people who've seen things which other people have subsequently said was the Kraken, but there are only not too many at all. So it's not like UFOs or Loch Ness Monster, where there's lots of witnesses. There are very few witnesses of the Kraken, and I've tabulated them on here, and this is very unhelpful because it's so small none of you will be able to read it at all, so I'll take you through it. So, roundabouts before 1752, two fishermen off the Fredrikstad in Auga House, which apparently is somewhere in Norway, encountered a sea like thick mud, and the horns of the Kraken crushed part of their boat. Very unfortunate. 1752, a dead Kraken was found off the Isle of Mickle Row, which is in the Shetlands, I think. Captain Douglas not finding a Kraken, I've already mentioned. There was a disappearing island off the coast of Rothshire, which wasn't actually suggested by the witnesses as being a Kraken, but some other people did reckon it was a Kraken. So again, we have an association of this concept, this woolly concept of the Kraken, with an island fish, not with a cephalopod. Another green island was another disappearing island off the coast of Scotland, which again was claimed to have been a Kraken. And then in 1786, we have an affidavit signed by two Scandinavian fishermen in Dundee in front of magistrates to say they'd actually seen the Kraken. Actually, I'll read the account of that, if I can find it in my voluminous notes. There we go. It was recorded in the Annals of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. At the same meeting, a letter was read by John Ramsay, Esquire, one of the Justices of the Peace of the County of Forfar, and Mr. John Gild, one of the magistrates of Dundee, enclosing an affidavit made before them of Jens Anderson, Master, and Mads Jensen, made to the Norwegian ship relating the appearance of a supposed Kraken or sea worm on Sunday, August the 15th, 1786. We're almost just past the anniversary of that sighting, about 15 leagues to the eastward of the coast of Scotland, at north latitude 56 degrees 16 minutes. The appearance was that of three low islands or sandbanks of a grey colour within less than a mile's distance from the ship and extending about 3 miles from the one extremity to the other. So it's a big animal. It remained in sight for about 50 minutes, and upon the springing up of a breeze, gradually sank into the water. The account contains no further particulars worthy of notice, and is perfectly confident with the idea of this being nothing more. It's not really clear nothing more than what, just nothing more. So, there we have an account of a first-hand account of the Kraken. Well, sort of first-hand, it's an affidavit. 1795 to 1799, a boat en route for either from Archangel or Greenland, encounters some unmarked rocks which disappear when the boat is sent out to investigate, and that's interpreted by the witnesses as being a kraken. A whaler, Captain Folger of Nantucket, reports encountering a kraken off the coast of Brazil. That's the first southern hemisphere appearance of the kraken. And we've already mentioned another Scandinavian, Jean Magnus Dens, fights off an anchor troll, which is a synonym for the kraken, sometimes used in Scandinavia. Also in the southern hemisphere. And this was interpreted by the dodgy Frenchman, Pierre de Montfort, as an attack by an octopus. Now, octopus is very, very timid. There's no real record of octopuses or squids attacking a boat, apart from very, very recently, a trimarang, which was a squid attached to it in an ocean race. 1802, a gentleman called Anderson saw the arms of a kraken in the sea off Bergen. A carcass was found in 1803, but it wasn't kept. That's a shame. A kraken seen off Scalloway in Shetland, and another kraken was seen off Bearer in Shetland as well. Now you might think, well, by this stage everybody thinks that the kraken was an invertebrate, that is, an animal without a backbone, but that's not true, because in 1830 somebody actually tried to sell the vertebrae of a kraken in a sale in London. Finally, in 1846, I think they're Inuit, in the Canadian Arctic, they also saw a kraken-like animal, also known as a Ninaluk, which was a big white animal with kind of white sails, which they interpreted as being a kraken. So we have this kind of amorphous series of eyewitness accounts of the kraken, and none of them are directly interpretable as a cephalopod. For sure, some of them have cephalopod characteristics. We see reports of arms, but again, a consistent feature of many of these reports is the large size of this animal and the fact it's like a disappearing island. So, nowadays, of course, everybody says, if you look on Wikipedia, you'll find it, that the kraken is based on a giant squid. In fact, I tried to change the Wikipedia page, and I was kind of outvoted by subsequent Wikipedians when I tried to correct the page with facts, which just goes to show what a sinister, evil, and ultimately fruitless thing Wikipedia actually is. Like, for a very, very long time. It's a bit like communism, fine idea in practice, but horrible in... fine idea in theory, but horrible in practice. So this is the giant squid. But of course, many people were actually credulous, were sceptical about the giant squid, and here is one of them. Not the person you might necessarily think would be sceptical about the kraken, but this is John Wesley, founder of Methodism, and he actually said, "I desired to read part of Bishop Pontefrakt's Natural History of Norway. I soon found he was a man of sense, yet credulous in the extreme, and therefore I was less surprised when I came to the kraken and the sea serpent. Of the former, an animal a mile round, to which a poor whale is but a gudgeon, he gives no proof or shadow of proof, nothing but vague, uncertain heresies." You could invite John Wesley to a meeting of the Edinburgh Skeptics, couldn't you, this gentleman? So, you know, he doesn't accept mere hearsays. He wants good, hard evidence. Good for you, John Wesley. So, what is the origin of the kraken? Well, I think the kraken is an amorphous thing. It has lots and lots of different origins, but part of its origins come and are associated with the clue to their origins comes with Hans Egede, because Hans Egede famously said, as I mentioned before, that in Iceland the animal was called Hafgufa. And this term Hafgufa is not the first time it's ever been used. It has an earlier history. And in the 14th century, a very strange book was written called the Konungs Gudsja, which is the King's Mirror, which was it was two things. One, it was a guide for good behaviour on the parts of young aristocrats, and also it was a guide to the wonders of the North, written by somebody associated with the Norwegian-Danish court. And in this book, where the author is talking about wonders of the North, he talks about this animal called the Hafgufa. And he gives it the characteristics that the kraken has in Pontefrakt's book. It's very, very large, it looks like an island, and it produces this breath or excrement which attracts fish to it, which it then eats. So that's the Half-Cooper. Well, that animal, the Half-Cooper, of course, also occurs in another series of medieval books as well, but not under the name Half-Cooper. But that's in the medieval bestiaries. And in the medieval bestiaries, we have this animal called the island monster, for want of a better term. Often it's given the name Ballina, the name we now use, of course, for whales. But also, it could be called Aspigillone, the shield turtle, Jusconius, a whole variety of different names. So basically, though, it's an animal that lives in the sea. It's huge, and it's so huge it can be taken for an island. Indeed, some people have had the misfortune of actually landing on the island, setting up camp, and then being dragged to the depths because the animal wakes up and panics and dies. And of course, because it's from a bestiary, which are a moralizing text, it is a hint as to what will happen to you sinners if you don't change your ways, and you will be dragged to hell just as the poor unfortunate sailors are when they encounter the Aspigillone. Now this history of the Aspigillone, the giant whale-like animal that's taken for an island, that dates back to the Greek Physiologus, which is the precursor of the bestiaries, and then those sorts of stories are circulating in the Middle East. They also occur in the Thousand and One Nights. Sinbad encounters an island fish, and they may actually date back partially to the Talmud, because there's a very similar sort of account of a hero who mistakes a rabbi who mistakes a hill for a sleeping dragon, or something like a dragon, for a hill, and he sleeps on it or he eats on it, and it wakes up and causes all sorts of mayhem. The other person who encounters the island fish is Saint Brendan, a medieval Irish saint, and he wandered around. He's an early explorer of the Atlantic, and he encounters all sorts of strange things on his travels, including Judas Iscariot on an island in the middle of the Atlantic. But he also landed on the island fish, and was then amazed to discover it was actually a fish, and he had to disembark very, very quickly. Or in some stories, because he's a good and pious holy man, the animal didn't stir at all, which he would have done had it been sinners such as ourselves. So the history of the Kraken then is a rather convoluted tale that brings in lots of different things. Maybe in the most recent accounts it is a giant squid, but certainly in the oldest accounts it really was the island fish. How am I doing for time, ladies and gentlemen? Okay, right then, in which case then I'll move on and I'll talk about some other aspects of the giant squid. So the giant squid then has been interpreted as being the Kraken. Hopefully I've convinced you that the history of the Kraken is a bit more confusing than that. But the giant squid has been implicated by a number of authors as being like the source of every single possible sea monster. And again, just like in the case of the Kraken, I think that's an oversimplification. It's a convenient rationalization, which isn't actually true. So what I'd like to do in the remaining part of the time is go over some other sea monster accounts which have been interpreted as being Krakens. And those of you who attended my talk before, there will be a little bit of cetacean erotica on the way.
Whale porn.
Yeah. Cetacean erotica, okay. So, this is the sea monk, discovered in 1546 in the Øresund, the strait between Denmark and Sweden. It was delivered to the court of King Christian III of Denmark, and he, after ordering drawings to be made, he ordered it to be buried lest it produce foolish talk. The drawings made their way to the south of Europe, where they reached the court of Navarre, and the Queen of Navarre, Margaret of Navarre, she passed on the drawings of the sea monk to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was then in Spain. Holy Roman Emperor was so impressed with the drawings of the sea monk. According to one Danish chronicler, he actually formed an alliance with the Danes and the Scots because of the impressiveness of the sea monk. So there we go, the sea monk. And if you don't think that's important, the Catholic whore, Mary Queen, I mean the rightful the rightful Catholic Queen of England, Mary Stuart, when she was under house arrest by the Protestant bastard Elizabeth. I'm in Scotland, different story in England. She actually engaged in an embroidery project with Jana, the Countess of Shrewsbury, and in that she embroidered various animals from a zoological textbook by a gentleman called Gesner, and that included a drawing of the sea monk. If you go to a stately home in Norfolk, which I've forgotten the name of, you'll actually see the embroidered sea monk, spelled M-O-O-N-K-E, which was actually embroidered by Mary Queen of Scots in that stately home. So obviously all these Renaissance monarchs are really impressed by the sea monk. And the sea monk has important implications for the giant squid story, because the giant squid owes its binomial name, Architoithes monicus, to the sea monk. Because in 1857, a gentleman called Jupiter Steenstrup, he described the giant squid, and he was convinced that the giant squid was the source of this animal. The reason for that can be seen in the next drawing. The top three drawings from the left are actually drawings that were made, well, compiled by Steenstrup. This, and this are all Renaissance drawings of the sea monk in differing styles. I quite like this one. This is obviously the sea monk as country bumpkin, which is interesting because it's actually described with the Latin word agrestis. You know what agrestis means?
Sorry, my Latin and
Well, it apparently has connotations of yokel or bumpkin. It is an adjective to describe that thing. And the animal described as agrestis. And I suspect this is probably closest to the truth than all the rest of the drawings. Anyway, Steenstrup reckoned it was a giant squid, because he reckoned if you place a giant squid in this posture that you see here, it roughly has the proportions of at least these two sea monk drawings. The problem with that is that this sea monk was about 2.5 meters long. And that isn't the shape of an Architoithes, the giant squid. That's the shape of Loligo, the common squid of the North Atlantic. But that doesn't grow to 2.5 meters long. If it was a giant squid, its body shape would be more like that. And so it becomes a little bit less compelling case. Now, nowadays, of course, in English and also in Norwegian, we have two fishes that we call monkfish. One of them is this one, the anglerfish, Lophius, very, very nice eating. And this one as well, Squatina, the angel shark. And we call these both monkfish. And this one actually does look a bit like a cowed monk, if you've drunk enough. I personally think that if we're going to try and say is there a zoological origin for the sea monk, I suspect it's probably more likely to be an angel shark than a giant squid, but I keep an open mind. But Steenstrup was totally taken by the sight of it, and therefore he gave the giant squid the binomial name Architoithes, ruling squid, monicus, just that's the Latin for monk. So that's the first rationalisation, well, the second if you count the Kraken, of the sea monk, the giant squid as a sea monster. What about some other examples of the giant squid being interpreted as a sea monster? If you buy a book called Monsters of the Sea by Richard Ellis, he's full of interpretations of giant squid as sea monsters. He believes actually every single of the major sea monster sightings of the last 200 years are down to giant squid. This one then, this goes back to our old friend Hans Egede. This was a monster that was seen by somebody in his group, possibly his son, in 1734. This was an animal that reared itself out of the water, had a long snake-like tail, and big flappers. And various people have suggested that this might have been a giant squid. Here's the image that's been used by a gentleman called Henry Lee way back in the 19th century to suggest that what was interpreted as being a sea monster, you see on the left-hand side, was actually a giant squid floundering in the water because it had some buoyancy problems. It would have to be quite strange buoyancy problems to actually get that posture. Of course, those of you who attended my talk before, we did suggest an alternative suggestion for what could be the cause of that sighting. This, for those of you who don't know, is an image of a whale. It's a male whale. It's a happy male whale. Citation erotica, whale porn.
It's a sperm whale.
No, this is it's a grey whale.
Worth a try.
It's actually one of my colleagues. It actually seems to be able to recognise the species of whale by their penises, which I think is useful. This one, anybody know what this species is? It's not a whale.
It is narwhal.
No, it's not a narwhal. This is a right whale. Again, the penis of a right whale. It's probably two whales there. That's one behind and one in front. And as you can see, well, it could produce a snake-like tail, or even these sort of sea monsters, Nessie-like ones with heads and necks, could be interpreted in this way. Now, I'm not being dogmatic about this. I'm just suggesting this is a potential explanation for sea monster sightings. This is another one which has been interpreted as a giant squid. Now this is a sighting from the 1890s, and this was the bark Pauline, which was off the coast of Brazil, and it encountered, quote, 3 sperm whales, frantic with excitement, 1 bull and 2 female and 2 cows, and the bull sperm whale was in the situation of having this constricting like serpent wrapped around it. So you might say, well, this is, if you take the eyewitness testimony at face evidence, that would seem quite compelling. But some people have said, well, actually, it was probably a sperm whale that was feeding off a giant squid, because sperm whales do feed off giant squid, so this was the poor giant squid trying to stop itself getting actually eaten by the sperm whale, which is quite compelling. I would suggest, though, that the previous suggestion might hold here. The animals were described as being frantic with excitement, and it's a bull sperm whale with 2 females. And also, it doesn't really fit, because if you look at the diagnostic features, the animal is described as being very, very white. The giant squid is maroon. It probably wasn't a constricting serpent, because if you think about it, sperm whales can hold their breath for a very long time. Also, they have collapsing lungs. So the one mode of attack, which if you want to be a predator on a sperm whale, being a constricting boa constrictor like sea serpent would be a really bad idea. So that's probably not a thing. And of course, the polar whales were frenzied with excitement. So maybe that was an example of cetacean erotica once more. So yes, we should really consider the possible there. Here's another example. This is perhaps the most famous sea serpent sighting of all time. This is where the crew and officers and crew of HMS Daedalus in 1848 en route to St. Helena saw a sea serpent-like animal in the South Atlantic. And again, it was interpreted by Henry Lee in the 1870s as being a giant squid. Well, it could have been, but it could have been lots of other things as well. So that's really the convoluted history of the giant squid, then being taken for monsters. Here's another example of it being taken for a monster. This is a sea serpent seen by HMS Pumper in the tail end of the 19th century. And again, that was interpreted by some people as being an encounter with a giant squid. The wrong colour, so the surface, you've never really seen giant squid at the surface. The L. Sprague de Camp, he's a very famous skeptical writer, isn't he? He also rewrote the Conan books. He reckons this was a canoe, this sighting. It was a native canoe that had gone and washed out to sea, and the sailors on board just mistook it for a giant squid. If you want to see what a giant squid actually looks like, this is the second time that they were filmed alive. Yeah, you'll find on the web people say this is the first time they were filmed live. It wasn't true. A live one was filmed in some rock pools off the coast of Japan, but this was one that was caught on a long line in the Pacific, and then brought to the surface. And you can see they are this kind of dark-coloured maroon colour. Giant squid grows to about 57 foot long. Exactly how long they could grow is something I'm going to be looking at as part of my holidays this year. I've got a little scheme to investigate how big giant squids grow to make an informed statistical estimate of that. So keep your eyes out for that one. That should be an interesting paper. Finally, my brilliance will be recognised by the narrow-minded scientific community. So, and indeed Wikipedia as well. So what's the moral of my squiddy tale? Well, the moral of my squiddy tale is twofold, really. One, I think the history of sea monsters is a lot more complicated than simply saying it was this species that was misinterpreted by things. Monsters are subject to change. You see that with the characteristic of the Kraken. It has this sweet breath that attracts fishes, because that originally actually wasn't a characteristic of the island monster at all in the Vestries. It was a characteristic of the animal that was right next to them in the Vestries, which was the panther. The panther had this charming breath which attracted animals towards it. And then somebody at some stage, there was a misprint and it got associated with the island fish. There's a similar story actually associated with another monster of the seas called the Xiphias, which the Xiphias is the Greek for the swordfish. By the medieval bestiary times it had become a monster, and this is a picture of it. Can't see too well actually here. And then it was reused as the binomial name for Cuvier's beaked whale, which is now called Xiphias. So Xiphias was the Greek swordfish, and still used for it, the name for the swordfish, becomes a medieval monster, which then becomes the basis for the binomial name of Cuvier's beaked whale. So the history of monsters is very, very convoluted, so you shouldn't really think of it as being so simplistic. The other take-home message, I think is a very important one for skeptics, and it is the tendency, we have a tendency to find convenient rationalizations of things. We find a convenient explanation for a given anomalous phenomena, and we accept that uncritically, just in the way other people might accept things uncritically, and we just accept it. Everybody knows the Kraken is based on a giant squid. It seems a nice, convenient explanation, which people just accept, but in fact, if you look into the facts of the matter, it isn't really that clear a story. And that's a danger for anybody who's investigating strange, anomalous phenomena. At that point, I probably think I should